All right. Good morning, folks. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is part 2 of the December Q&A. Now, firstly, I just want to ask you, if you are not subscribed to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. Apparently, 35% of you are tune in regularly, but are not subscribed. So it would really help me out a lot if you subscribed. And whenever I say that, which is every now and again, it does seem to bump up the numbers. So that would be a big help. So let's go on with the Q&A. The questions, by the way, are posted on YouTube and also on Instagram roughly every month. So feel free to watch out for that and stick your question there. It has a much better chance of being answered if you put the question in one of those posts. So here we go. We've got some really good questions, like loads this month, which is awesome. So thank you for the questions, and some really good ones too. So I picked out a few more for part 2, and the first one is from David Wang. Now, David is an OG of the channel, so appreciate you and thank you for the question. And this was a really good question because it ties into a lot of the discussions that have been going on in the natural YouTube bodybuilding community over the last couple of weeks. So David says, what are your thoughts on adding more volume on a bulk, even when you're progressing already, but you generally feel you could do a bit more? Okay. Or should you stick with what's working? He says, for example, if you're doing 16 sets of chest, and this allows a rep 2 here on all movements, would it be worth adding one more set if you feel like you could? And he mentions MRV, maximum adaptive volume, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, great question. So I think at the heart of this is looking at some of the downsides and the benefits of adding more volume. And the way that I always like to think about it is, think of volume as the magnitude of stress. Okay, all volume is just adding more stress to your body so it can adapt. And think about it in this way. If we take any adaptation in the body, let's say getting a tan, like me right now, I've not been in the sun for a while. I'm absolutely pasty, similar to this. In the dead of winter, you're not going to expect that. So in the summer, when I'm perhaps going out in the sun more, my skin's going to get more exposure to the sun, and it's going to react to that by getting darker, more bronzed. Makes sense. Now, if I wanted to initiate that tan quicker, I could either wait for a brighter day, that is the intensity, or I could stay out in the sun for longer, that is the volume in a sense. So if we think about it in that way, what we need to do with training is we need to ensure there is a sufficient intensity, because obviously if I go out now in the middle of the day, nothing's going to change. I'm still going to be as pasty as I am now because there's no sun. The sun is really low. So the intensity is really low. So my first point of action for any new client is, let's get you to the point where you're working hard enough so you can initiate some gains. Now, David is doing that. David is training hard enough so he's seeing some gains. So at that point, we can increase volume, which increases the magnitude of the stress. So it's like staying out for longer in the sun in the summer. So the adaptation occurs quicker. It's a very good analogy, and that works for most adaptations in the body. There is a sort of a point where you have to do just enough to see some gains, and then adding more will accelerate those gains. And at a certain point, you'll fall off the cliff. You'll either get burnt in the case of your skin, or in the case of training, you'll overtrain, overreach, and something will go wrong. So as I was saying, there is some confusion over when that slips off and when we start to get into negative territory, because I can tell you from my experience, I have done more than I needed. I've started to get the negative effects, but I've still continued to gain. And I think this is where the tricky area is, because you'd think to yourself, well, I'm doing enough, I'm doing the right amount if I'm gaining, right? It makes sense. But actually, there's a nuance to that. Like you're pointing out, there is an optimal amount where you're getting the best gains roughly for you, but at the same time, you're not delving into the point where you're getting negatives. Because what are the negatives that could come up and you're still gaining? So you could still gain strength, gain muscle in the gym if you start to get small aches and pains, if your sleep starts to go wrong, if your appetite gets messed up, if your heart rate gets elevated, all these kind of things. So there is a bit of an area of the curve where you could continue to add volume and you still get messed up. So it's pretty much unnecessary. You might get more gains, you might not, but you definitely are getting some of the negative effects, and that's not sustainable. Now, when you're younger, you have a lot more leeway. The body is a lot more resilient. those aches and pains due to your hormones and your body just being quite resilient and new, those things will just be shrugged off. And I think with a lot of you guys, particularly if there's one thing that the MRV, MAV kind of concept has not really touched on, is that little zone there where, you know what, you're getting the maximum-ish amount of gains and you add even more work on and you're still gaining, but you're slowly also seeing joint degradation, sleep issues, and various overtraining symptoms. But you can't quite say you're overreaching or overtraining because you're still gaining muscle, you're still gaining strength. And I've heard this point made by Mike before, and that is this idea that if you are gaining strength and muscle continuously and consistently, you can't possibly be overreaching or overtraining. And I think that's not quite true. I think there's a bell curve there. And as you start to go off and do way too much volume, or even that could be just an extra 2 or 3 sets, I think then you can get into that overreaching area where you do start to see aches and pains. Just to give you some numbers, let's say, for example, you do 16 sets of chest per week and you're gaining great with no aches and pains. Everything's good, sleep's good, mood's good, everything. Let's say you go to 18 sets or 20 sets, and actually you're still gaining tremendously well. You might even gain faster, but you slowly start to see some joint degradation, some aches and pains, sleep starting to go off, mood starting to go off as well. But you're like, I'm gaining faster. That type of reaction is not sustainable. And that's what I'm talking about. So I think to answer your question, let's just bring it right back. To answer your question, this is a topic which is very nuanced. And I certainly don't think with Mike's like escalating volume model where you start low, go high, and then you deload, I don't think it's a problem to be in that zone for 1 or 2 weeks. So I think it's actually a very sensible approach. But he definitely flirts on doing too much and then deloading. Is that necessary? I don't know. It's a very guaranteed way of getting gains. I've run those kind of models before. I ran them with clients before as well. But there is a danger when you're getting to those final couple of weeks, the injury risk is a lot higher. To answer your question, could you add some more? You could, but I think you have to be very wary of the signs. And just because you carry on gaining muscle and strength doesn't mean that all is hunky-dory, because there is a certain period of time where you can carry on gaining muscle and strength, but your recovery is being compromised. And I'd say for most people that doesn't happen until they get quite a way ahead. There is a lot to that discussion. I'm actually going to do a video about this because I want to throw my hat into the ring of minimalism training and all that kind of stuff that the Alex, Natural Hypertrophy, and Landon from Basement Bodybuilding have been talking about. So I'd like to throw my hat into the ring on that because I think it's a very nuanced topic which it needs explaining. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I think it was a really good question. And yeah, I think there is a possibility, and I understand why you would want to. I just think be very wary of signs of overtraining. Doesn't mean that you're all okay as long as you're gaining strength. Again, I've been there, and joints will degrade. Eventually, you will run into a wall, and that wall will usually be an injury. So be wary. But great question. Okay, next question by Riccardo Carlini. Riccardo is also an OG of the channel. You know what I really like? Like the fact the channel is now, I think this channel is about 1.5 years old now. I've only been on YouTube for 1.5 years. I love the fact that I recognize all these names. So we have a little community here, which is amazing. It's really nice. It does get me right in the feels. So I like it. Anyway, stop talking about that. Ricardo's got a very good question. This is a really interesting question. He says, hi Faz, I finally tested for the first time my squat, bench and deadlift. So Ricardo's been running, I think, my tactician or my wizard routine for a while now. He said he ended up with a 140 squat, and he said it could have been 150. A 90 kilo bench and a 175 deadlift. Really good numbers, like solid numbers, solid intermediate numbers, like really good. So that's roughly a 3-plate bench, just shy of a 3-plate squat, just shy of a 2-plate bench, and just shy of a 4-plate deadlift. So really good. He says, next week I'll be back to bodybuilding and I'm thinking of doing basically upper body specialization. He said he was sure of doing things in this way, but after my recent video on lagging body parts, he's not so sure whether he wants to specialize. Now, the reason I want to bring this question to you guys and why I think it's interesting is I want to look at strength ratios. How do we know he's either lagging or he's balanced? Firstly, I think we can look at his physique. Okay, so Ricardo's never provided me with pictures of his physique, but if we assume, we can look at his physique and maybe have a look at what looks imbalanced. So that's one way that you guys can check at home. Now, the other thing is, and I think this is what he's pointing out, he thinks his numbers are perhaps a bit skewed. I would have to say those numbers you have now are actually very balanced. I would argue maybe your squat is a little bit higher, proportionally speaking, and your bench is a little bit lower. But I think apart from that, those numbers are actually very proportional. That is pretty much the numbers that I had in my first major stall. And I've told that story many times. But yeah, I think we have to bear this in mind. And there's an important reason why. I think good average targets is something like the 3, 4, and 5, like a 3-plate bench, 4-plate squat, 5-plate deadlift. And I know people disagree with that, but that's not the point. What I'm trying to say is proportional development. And so Ricardo with a 2-plate bench, 3-plate squat, 4-plate deadlift, that's proportional. That's what your strength roughly should look like. So if you got guys who are benching 100, squatting 100, that means it's not even. Their squat is woefully less than their bench. And in the same way, if your squat is the same as your deadlift, there is definitely something wrong there. Either your deadlift is very undertrained, or sometimes what happens is your squat is very high. So yeah, I think you have to be very careful about understanding what strength ratios are. Each lift has got a different potential. And on average, there are outliers, and I know there are going to be outliers, so I totally understand that. But on average, you're looking at roughly a squat, which is about a plate aside higher than a bench, a deadlift, which is about a plate aside higher than a squat. That's roughly what the strength ratios are. And where you're at now with squat a little bit higher, bench a little bit lower, deadlift a little bit lower, it's honestly very, very even. Yeah, I think that's important because the amount of people that I see whose bench is proportionately a lot higher than their squat and deadlift is insane. Like, it's very common for guys to be squatting in the low to mid 200, benching in the low to mid 200s and squatting the same and deadlifting maybe only a little bit higher. And then what happens is their bench stalls. So they think, my bench is stalling. I can't believe it. But my squat and deadlift are moving up nicely. That's because you've been sandbagging your squat and deadlift. So please do bear that in mind. If your squat and bench are exactly the same, you have been sandbagging the hell out of your squat, and that needs to improve. And probably the best thing you can do for your development overall is to bring up your squat and deadlift. So I think just bear that in mind. I think good approximate rough strength ratios, and use that to decide on what you want to specialize on. Ricardo, I'd say for you, I wouldn't specialize on your upper body right now. I think that's very normal. I would also say my upper body, particularly my chest, shoulders, and arms, my chest and shoulders, not my arms, my chest and shoulders didn't really look like much until I was benching about 140. I think obviously there is a hypertrophy focused way of doing that, which I think is very sensible. So I'm glad you're getting back to bodybuilding. Honestly, for you, Ricardo, I would either run a more advanced version of the Wizard with restricted rest periods, or I would, if you've got 4 days to train, I would go for the Barbarian, because I think that is a very good routine. It's very balanced. It's very hypertrophy focused, and ensuring you're getting a reasonable amount of volume in the safe lifts. That's what I would do. I think it's good that you have pushed for strength and you've tested out your strength. It's great. It's good. Why not? Let's have fun. But I think ultimately, if you want to get to the point where you have a more advanced look, I would focus on a very hypertrophy version. And if it's full body, yeah, I think that's great. Go with the Wizard, a more advanced version of the Wizard, perhaps stage 2 or even stage 3. And with the Barbarian, yeah, stage 1 or 2 is pretty good. Stage 3 on the Barbarian is very advanced. So yeah, just get yourself a reasonable amount of volume. I think it helps a lot. And it's a lot more indicative of getting the right amount of muscle in your frame. Just doing all that useful volume, which you can recover from and grow from, is really good for your overall development. So you don't want to be limited by your ultimate strength. So just, yeah, go with the hypertrophy stuff. Anyway, I like that question because it looks at strength ratios. And I think that's a really important discussion to show you where you're at. A lot of times we don't really know what is proportionally lagging or in front. So we guess, and a lot of it is based on bias. But that looks pretty proportional to me. I think you just need to get bigger overall. Most of the times, most people just need to get bigger overall. Yeah. So just not to bang on about that point too much, I'll cut it off there. So yeah, we'll go to the next question. Okay, but thank you. Next question is from Thai Spirit. He says, do you consider direct anterior delt work necessary for a non-competitive lifter, given the amount of stimulus they receive from other lifts, such as the bench press, etc.? Yeah, good question. So I think this is an argument which has been going on for a while. Now, here's something I'm going to say as a general kind of note on YouTube. a lot of people who make very big statements on YouTube are not coaches. Okay, just really remember that when you're depending on who you're listening to. Okay, a lot of guys on YouTube who make big statements like, we don't need to do anterior delt work because you chest press, or lots of other big statements. Bear in mind, they are YouTubers or they are influencers like Instagrammers or whatever. They don't actually work with people on a day-to-day basis. Now, when you work with people on a day-to-day basis, you do start to see trends, but there are always outliers. Now, I have a client right now. Shout out to Jonathan, big man. Jonathan is a guy where we've had this discussion before as well. And actually, we had it recently. And Jonathan's the kind of guy where he needs additional front delt work because whenever he presses, he has the type of build where he is naturally a pretty decent bencher and squatter. You should see him squat. It's beautiful. But also, traditionally, when he's pressed, he's always pressed with a wide grip. So he's never really got that much anterior delt work. And only really now does he need to add some specific anterior delt work in. So there are not that many hard and fast rules when it comes to this type of stuff. And the problem is, hard and fast statements, like massive dramatic statements, tend to make for good YouTube material. They tend to make for good Instagram material. But it's a lot of the times it's not really accurate to say that as a definitive statement. And when you work with a lot of people over the years, like I have, work with people every day, you start to notice, if you're open-minded, of course, you start to notice that there are exceptions. There are use cases for almost every scenario. So I don't think I could say this as a definitive yes or no. And I would caution you to very carefully screen anybody who does say large definitive statements like anterior delt work is not necessary. I think it was even Brad Schoenfeld who said on a post, it is highly, I think he said something like, it's highly unlikely front delt work is necessary. He was very careful about how he worded it. But some people have misinterpreted that and have just gone in full bore and said, yep, anterior delt work is stupid. It might be appropriate. So there are lots of big statements which, can you imagine? A video would do great if somebody entitled it, anterior delt work is stupid, with them in a vest. Or conversely, anterior delt work is needed by everyone. Whereas if I was to release a video on the topic, it might be something like anterior delt work, a nuanced topic. It's not as glamorous, it's not as exciting, but it's a lot more realistic for most of you. Yeah, there are use cases. I would say in my experience, because I press with a more tucked grip, I get a lot of triceps from delt from pressing. I also get a lot of front delts from pressing. I also get a lot of side delts from pressing too, chest pressing. But there you go. So I think whenever you see these statements, you have to use them as a starting point. Use them as a starting point and to determine what your own experience is. And this is really the important lesson of this question. If you never establish your own training parameters, you are constantly going to be on the ride from all of these YouTubers and influencers and Instagrammers who are telling you big statements. You're constantly going to be searching for information because you're never establishing what works for you. And this is why I think it's crucial to do that. This is why I recommend working with a coach, because a good coach who is thoughtful will encourage you to learn lessons about your training. That's what it's about. A good coach will acknowledge that from the beginning, the goal is to try and learn about you over the first 6 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever, and then use that knowledge to individualize your training. A good coach completely acknowledges there is very little to individualize when you first start working with somebody. That's the exploration phase. And if you're never actually exploring your own training, you're always going to be chasing these big statements, the next big statement, the next influencer to tell you what to do here or what to do there, what to do there. Establish your own training parameters. So I would turn that question back around to you and go, give it 3 months, an experiment, and then you come back to me in 3 months and tell me whether you need anterior delt work or not. Yeah. So set your alarm, 3 months. All right. Next question is from Adam Limbach. This is more of a fun question. So Adam says, Smith machine seems to get a really bad rep. Yes, it does. It's not a new thing either. The Smith machine has been getting a bad rap as long as I've been lifting. Yeah. So I'll tell you a story. Back in the day, I used to be part of this forum of lifters. It was the first forum I really got into. and they were so anti Smith machine. Like I was completely brainwashed. The first year of my training, completely brainwashed, and I never used a Smith machine. I just thought it was terrible. As soon as you even touched it, you were going to get injured. If you even came within the same 5-yard vicinity as a Smith machine, that's it. You're just going to fall dead. But these people were so obsessed with talking about how crappy the Smith machine was, they actually wrote to the inventor of the Smith machine or something like that. And apparently their whole argument was the Smith machine locks you into a movement path, and that's why it's bad for you. And so they said, look, they emailed this company. For some reason, the company actually emailed them back, and the company said, yes, our machines, you're correct. They do lock you into a movement path. That is the point of the machine. And in fact, you can see it because there's a large metal bolt which attaches the bar to the chassis. So you are correct. It does move it in a predetermined position. You're right. Well done. And so these guys were really excited. They took that as a victory. They came back to the forum. See, told you guys. They admitted it. They admitted they are out there basically killing people. And I was reading this letter and thinking, that's not what they said, though. It was obviously a very sarcastic letter, but I don't know. So anyway, yeah, the Smith machine has been getting a bad rap for ages, but it's a lot like, I think where it initially comes from is probably a misunderstanding. It's just people being a little bit mob mentality, a little bit overexcited. They perhaps got an injury. They want to blame somebody because not taking personal responsibility is not just the domain of 2020. That's been going on for years. Don't let any old timer tell you that back in the day we used to take responsibility. No, they didn't. They would blame everybody else just like anyone now. So there's always that lack of personal responsibility. I imagine it was some of that. Some of it was just probably just a lot of, just low IQ thinking, like a lot of communities back in the day. But things like the sumo deadlift, that's been getting a bad rap as well. What originally started off as a joke is now people actually take it seriously, like sumo is cheating. But that originally started off as a joke. That's the funny thing. But these jokes get lost in the annals of time. And all of a sudden you get new people who are exposed to this and go, sumo's bad. Okay. And then they tell their friend, like, sumo's cheating. Oh, crap. His friend tells his friend. And all of a sudden it's on social media, it blows up, and nobody really remembers where it came from. It was just a joke originally, but there you go. So Smith machine gets a bad rap. I personally think it's fine. I think any exercise you do with a barbell, you can do on the Smith machine. I would also go so far as to say, if you train by yourself at home and you have a choice of getting either a power rack or a Smith machine, as long as you're not a powerlifter, I would probably go with the Smith machine. I think you can train harder on a Smith machine and probably safer as well. So I think the Smith machine has a lot to be said for it. So I think they're quite good. I don't actually use one right now, but that's because we have a lot of good machines at the gym. So if I was to use, actually no, tell a lie, I do some pressing on the Smith machine and some good mornings. So it's fine. It's honestly not a problem at all. Again, I just think it's one of those things where it's mob mentality. People don't think for themselves. It's just general low IQ thinking, really. I've not been presented a good argument in 22 years of why the Smith machine gets a bad rap. So I think it's just people being a bit thick. So there you go. I'm sure that will get me downvoted. Give me a good argument for why. Not you, Adam, but anybody else. Okay, next question is from Callan. Callan says, is it possible to become caffeine resistant? Yeah, so he said he took a break from caffeine for about 2 weeks. Nothing really happened. And the first coffee after that, it didn't really hit him. And he misses the boost he got when he first tried an energy drink in secondary school. Now he can consume caffeine right before bed and it doesn't affect him at all. His average intake is 500 milligrams. Okay, I would say if your average intake is 500 milligrams, that's a lot of caffeine. So I've pretty much cut out all caffeine now, but even I would consider a 200 milligram shot of caffeine quite a lot. There's two things. Firstly, nothing hits like it did in secondary school, okay? Nothing. Tea doesn't taste the same. Coffee doesn't taste the same. Caffeine doesn't taste the same. Chocolate doesn't taste the same. Your first love isn't the same as when you're younger. Nothing is the same. This is part of getting older, Callan, okay? Your emotions and your feelings do tend to stabilize. And if I've always worked with younger people, either when I was teaching or even now I have some younger clients, and there is always a heightened level of emotion when you're at that age of roughly before, I would say probably 23 to 24, maybe it depends how quick you mature, but certainly before 21, there is this heightened level of emotionality, and definitely before 18. So as you go through that period of time where you're 16 to 25, those emotions tend to calm down and relax. You tend to mature. Stuff that happens to you before you're 16 seems like a big deal, and it gets very blown up in your brain. And I was the same way. It's just the way you are. And you start to realize as you get older that all that energy you expended when you're younger with your first love, your first kiss, all that kind of stuff was just crazy. So yeah, you have a lot more sensitivity to things when you're younger. So you might just be getting older, bro. I don't know. But I would say the other thing is, if you are on 500 milligrams of caffeine a day, you're not going to be able to feel much. I would really encourage you to cycle your caffeine in. That's a lot. Because at that point, you probably are still getting some metabolism boosting effects, but you're not going to be getting the appetite suppression. You're not going to be getting the boost. So if you want the appetite suppression and the boost, you've got to cycle your caffeine in and out. Like, you've got to take maybe 2 weeks off regularly. If I was to make a suggestion, I would say, if you're working in, let's say you're working in blocks like I promote, let's say you have a 6-week block with ending with a deload. Maybe you have no caffeine on your deload, no caffeine first week of training, maybe no caffeine second week of training, and then weeks 3, 4, and 5 start to bring in the caffeine. That's going to give you a lot more bang for your buck. Yeah, I think 500 milligrams is a lot. I would cycle that if you want to get the best benefit. And also, yeah, again, nothing hits like it did when we were younger. It's just life. All right, final question is from Bash. And this is something which quite a few of my clients wanted me to address this publicly. And it's the whole Liver King debacle. I haven't yet because, I don't know, I have thoughts on the topic, but I wasn't sure if I was going to do a whole video on it. But this gives me an opportunity to at least address what I think of the Liver King scenario. And you know what? I'm going to refer to him as Brian from now on, because it was never about the liver, and he's definitely not a king. So Brian, let's talk about Brian. It's a lot less glamorous than the Liver King. So Brian ran a big scam where he was telling people his physique was the result of the 9 ancestral tenets, part of which was taking your top off all the time and all this kind of stuff. And apparently he poops out in the garden and he doesn't wipe. That's also in a video, which is really weird, but never mind. So yeah, and it turns out he's just on a lot of steroids and his body is not the result of just hard work and good genetics. Now, I think, firstly, let's get this out of the way. We everyone in this community knew that. I think there were some normies who probably didn't know and thought he was natural because he kept saying he was. I mean, there are some normies out there who still think Arnold was natural back in the day. I've talked to them. They still insist Arnold's natural. Clearly, he's even admitted on camera he's not. So the steroid question, I think we could just push that to one side. We all knew it. It was pretty obvious. Duh. And I'm not going to be another one of those trite influencers who spend their whole post talking about, oh, we all knew this. Yeah, okay. No one's giving you a prize for knowing a guy who's bloated like a tomato at 45 and clearly looks like steroids is on steroids. So let's ignore that for a second. It's obvious. We get it. Okay. I think what was more concerning for me was the fact that people are still taking his diet advice very seriously. That for me is the bigger issue. The steroid issue, people are all like, yeah, we knew that all along. Okay, cool. So with that, it's like, you're either going to take it or you're not. Whatever. All right. That's your choice. It's not going to be affected by the Liver King or by Brian or his stance on things. What's more worrying, though, is that the diet advice that he proposed, and the same as his business partner, Paul Saladino, who says he's innocent in the whole thing, the diet advice is actually very dangerous. Now, my concern is more that the diet advice is what people are thinking, actually, you know what, he might still be right about that. That's where I worry, because that is a type of thing where if you're not sure what to do, if you are looking for some kind of magic pill, some kind of solution, you might be drawn to that. And you might think, oh yeah, you know what, Brian, he was on roids. Oh, that was obvious, but he's still got good diet advice. No, he doesn't. Right? He's a roided up 45-year-old who is just after money. His diet advice was for the same reason, to position him in a certain point in the market so he could sell you things because he was different. It's classic. What stands out, and this is the same answer to a question earlier, What stands out on social media is people who are different. That's what makes you look twice. That's what people listen to. A good physique, a strong statement. And Brian had both of those. A good physique, debatable. He had a standout physique, and he had a standout dietary statement, and he had a whole bunch of other statements about life and being a man. That kind of stuff, it's so low IQ. Like the amount of guys, like normies, who fall for that is ridiculous. The amount of normies who are 40 to 50 years old, who work in an office, who lift nothing heavier than a cup of tea all day and want to be warriors on the weekend is embarrassing. Grow up, right? It's embarrassing. So those are the people who will fall for this ancestral tenants carnivore BS. It's dangerous. There are two things which are pretty much agreed on that aren't going to be that great for your health, and that is high amounts of saturated fat and also high amounts of salt. And he was encouraging people to do both. And people think that's okay. And again, I know this is one of those comments which is going to get me downvoted, but if people are on the side of Liver King in that respect, you are not on the side of the majority. So if you want to take that risk with your health, do it, but be it on your head. That's what I'm saying. You can believe what you want to believe, and quite frankly, I don't really care about hearing your arguments in the comments to the contrary, because nothing is going to take the place of 50 years of what we know to be true based on large amounts of data and large amounts of outcomes in people. So if you want to take that gamble with your health, go and do it. But I think what's more dangerous about Brian is the diet advice, because that is the inconspicuous stuff which people still believe. We all sit back and go, yeah, the roid stuff obviously was no surprise there. But then people will still be following his diet advice, not having fruits and vegetables, having all this kind of stuff that he says, which is not only bad advice, but dangerous. That's my biggest problem. And it's the same issue with his business partner, Paul Saladino. And those are the types of issues, those types of things which are going to cause issues in 10, 20 years' time, not now. And so in 10 or 20 years' time, when people have these health issues because they've been eating in this ridiculously stupid way, and again, bear in mind, it's normally guys who are out of shape already and are looking for a magic pill answer. Like guys in their 40s, 50s, who probably already have issues with their health, which are either under the cover or have been diagnosed. Either way, they're already building problems and they're looking for a magic bullet. And they go onto this diet and their health worsens over time. 5 years, 10 years, they develop more atherosclerotic plaques, develop worse blood pressure, all that kind of stuff, and then they drop dead 10 years later. You can't pinpoint that on Brian or his business partners. Just say that again about that. If you want to take that gamble with your health, go for it. Your decision. But it's not on, you're not on the side of the majority. So there are two parts of this question to do with Brian. Firstly, what should happen to Brian? And secondly, we need to all be more aware of the information we're filtering. I think there are far too many people who are influenced by the way a message is delivered rather than by the content of the message. There are far too many people who are influenced by emotional ties to something. The classic one, which is doing the rounds right now, is masculinity-based stuff and science-based stuff. If you do those things and you are built pretty well and you have a standout message, you're going to attract attention. So if you leverage science, yeah, if you look unusual or authoritative, or you talk authoritatively, if you have a very standout message, all of these things are going to cause you to gain a lot of attention. And that is a problem because people listen to that without actually looking at what the data says, without looking at what the trends are, without let themselves be bought on emotion. So the other part of this question is people need to be a lot better at screening information. People need to be a lot better at screening information. How did we screen that Brian was on roids? It was obvious. Look at him. He looked like a tomato. Okay. Now, how do we screen that his diet advice is off? There's going to be a lot of you watching this right now who are going to be very insistent that his diet advice is right and be scrambling to write in the comments. So where are you getting that information from? YouTube? MDs on YouTube? Are you getting them from actual research articles? Are you getting them from actual, and also a lot of science out there is bad too. A lot of single papers will point at these small mechanistic things. But before you say, I've got this paper here, do you actually have the educational background necessary to screen those papers correctly? Because it's hard to do that. It's hard to interpret papers correctly. It's hard to interpret large bodies of data. I have a education background. I'm educated to the master's degree, and I started a doctorate as well. I have a background in research. I've performed research before, and even I struggle with interpreting a lot of this data. A lot of you are reading abstracts which have been misinterpreted by influencers with their tops off and making decisions about your health based on that. Stop. That's going to get you hurt in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time. So there are two parts to this question about Brian. Firstly, yeah, there does need to be some comeuppance for him. But secondly, we all need to be a lot better at screening where we get information and stop being so swayed by BS, which is normally in the face of somebody who quotes a lot of science, somebody who speaks authoritatively, mixing my words, and somebody who plucks at your emotional heartstrings rather than gives you cold, hard logic. But unfortunately, that is social media these days. That is where the majority of people get their information from. There is a large distrust of science. There is a large distrust of large data. It's all about who gives me that information in the best way. Very few people are looking or spending time actually learning how to interpret science correctly or interpret the data correctly. Lots of people are logging onto Instagram, onto YouTube, or reading abstracts of papers or reading singular papers. But without the background necessary to actually pass those things, the information age is not as glorious as we thought it would be. The information age has had the negative effect of leading a lot of people astray because they are unable to actually handle the sheer amount of information and find out and pass what is accurate from what is BS trying to sell you an opinion. And that is the big gap at the moment. That, I think, is one of the biggest problems we're going to face over the next 5 or 10 years. The amount of subtle BS out there is incredible. And people get their information now from social media, not from official sources, because there is a large mistrust of official sources. And those people in the social medias who want you to listen to them have started a campaign of actively getting you to distrust official sources. And you're falling for it. Not you, Bash, but I'm talking to people in general. Like, that is the big problem right now. So, yeah, I think it's a tough one. I don't see a way out anytime soon, because when people think they're right, they are very adamant about them being intelligent, read, and right when they're not. It's their lives, it's their health, it's their bodies. Good luck. Right, on that very pleasant nihilistic note, we'll end.